She did not read the name on the gate. She did not look at the crest carved into the stone above it, or notice the iron wolves set into the hinges, or register that the drive beyond it was 1/4 mile long and lined with oaks older than any family she had ever known. She just ran. The gravel bit through the thin soles of her shoes, her dress, ivory cotton, and already muddied at the hem from 2 miles of field and ditch, caught on a low branch as she cut across the lawn, and she heard the fabric tear, but didn't stop. Behind her, somewhere on the road she had left, a carriage was turning. She had perhaps 3 minutes before it reached the crossroads, and the driver saw which direction she had gone. The door was unlocked. That was the thing she would remember later, when she had time to remember anything at all. The great front door of the house, oak and iron and wide enough for 4 men to walk abreast, stood open by the width of a hand, as though someone had stepped out for air and not yet returned. She pushed through it and pulled it shut behind her, pressing her back against the wood. Her breath came in shallow, hitching gasps. Her hair had fallen from its pins on one side and hung across her cheek in damp, tangled waves. The entry hall stretched before her in silence, stone-flagged and high-ceilinged, lit by tall windows that threw long rectangles of pale afternoon light across the floor. And then she saw his face. He stood at the far end of the hall, near the foot of a staircase that curved upward into shadow. He was tall, broad through the shoulder, fair-haired with a side parting that caught the light and turned it the color of wheat. His eyes were grey, not the soft grey of overcast sky, but the hard, deliberate grey of flint, of something that had been struck many times and never broken. He wore a dark brown velvet frock coat over a cream waistcoat, and he held a letter in one hand, half read, as though she had interrupted him between one sentence and the next. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply looked at her, standing against his door with her torn dress and her wild hair, and the kind of fear in her eyes that does not come from imagination. "I am sorry," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "I did not know whose house this was. I only needed a door." The man folded the letter once, precisely, and set it on the table beside the staircase. "Whose house?" he said. "Did you think it was?" It was not a question, exactly. It was the kind of sentence that waits at the end of itself, patient, and expects the silence to do the work. "I did not think," she said. "I ran." He studied her for a long moment. His gaze moved from her face to the mud on her hem, to the torn sleeve, to the way her hand still pressed flat against the door behind her, as though she might need to open it again. "From what?" he said. "From whom?" she corrected, and then wished she hadn't, because it was the kind of precision that belonged in a study, not in a hallway where she was asking for shelter. But something in his expression shifted. Not warmth, not yet. Attention. "From whom?" he repeated. "A man called Roland Fenton. He believes I am going to marry him. My father promised him that I would, in exchange for the settlement of a debt. I have no intention of honoring that promise." The silence that followed was long enough to hear the clock in the next room. "Fenton," the man said. The name sat in his mouth the way a stone sits in a shoe. Something known, something tolerated, something that had not yet been worth removing. "And you are?" "Theodora Selwyn. Miss Selwyn." He said it the way a man reads a contract, noting every clause. "My name is Cresswell. This is Heatherton Hall, and you are standing in the private residence of the Duke of Heatherton, who happens to be the most inconvenient man you could have chosen to run to, or, depending on how you look at it, the most useful. She stared at him. The Duke of Heatherton. She had heard the name, the way one hears about storms in other counties, with the understanding that they are real and powerful and none of your concern. He sat in the House of Lords. He controlled estates across 3 shires. He had turned down a cabinet appointment the previous year for reasons no one could agree upon, and she had just burst through his front door with mud on her dress and her hair falling down. "I will leave," she said. "No," he said. "You will not." He crossed the hall in 6 strides, and she flinched, but he did not reach for her. He reached past her, to the door, and turned the lock. The bolt slid home with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. "If Fenton's carriage is on the road, he will come here within the hour. If you are found on the grounds, he will claim you. If you are inside this house, under my roof, he will have to claim you from me. And I assure you, Miss Selwyn, he does not have the means to do so." She looked at him. "You do not know me." "No," he agreed, "but I know Fenton. That is sufficient." The housekeeper was called Mrs. Dunning, and she had the kind of face that registered no surprise at anything because she had already imagined worse. She appeared in the hall within minutes, as though summoned by the particular quality of the silence rather than any bell, and she took one look at Theodora's muddied dress, one look at the Duke's expression, and said, "The east bedroom, Your Grace?" "Yes, and send Tate to watch the gate." Mrs. Dunning did not ask why. She simply nodded, and then she turned to Theodora with a gaze that was neither warm nor cold, but thorough, in the way of a woman who had been assessing people's needs for 30 years and did not intend to be wrong now. "Come with me, Miss Selwyn." The east bedroom was on the 2nd floor, overlooking a walled garden that had been, at some point, magnificent. Even from the window, with the late light slanting across it, Theodora could see the bones of it. The paths were overgrown but still visible, edged in stone that had shifted, but not collapsed. A glass house stood at the far wall, its panes clouded but intact. 3 raised beds near the south wall still held the remnants of what had once been a careful planting scheme. Gone wild now, rosemary tangling with lavender, chamomile spreading where it pleased. It was her Grace's garden, Mrs. Dunning said, following Theodora's gaze. The late Duchess. She kept it herself. After she passed, no one had the knowledge, and His Grace did not wish to hire someone who would change it. Theodora said nothing. She had spent 4 years cataloguing and cultivating plant specimens for Dr. Howell in Carminster, mapping the growth patterns of over 200 species, documenting soil conditions and light requirements, and the precise relationships between root systems. She had trained herself to look at a garden and see not what it was, but what it was trying to become. This garden was trying to come back. It simply needed someone who understood what it had been. But that was not her concern. She was a woman hiding in a stranger's house, and she had no intention of settling in. By the 3rd morning, she had already failed at leaving. Not for lack of trying. The first day, she had resolved to go at dawn, before anyone was awake, to walk the 12 miles to her cousin's house in Ardley, and find shelter there. But Mrs. Dunning had informed her, with the particular gentleness of someone delivering facts rather than opinions, that Mr. Fenton's man had been seen at the crossroads twice in 2 days, watching the traffic. The 2nd day, she had suggested writing to her cousin to arrange a carriage. The Duke, who appeared at mealtimes with the regularity of weather and spoke with the economy of a man who paid for his own words, had said only, "Write to whomever you wish, but do not assume Fenton is not watching the post." On the 3rd day, She stopped pretending she was leaving and began instead to work. It started with the garden. She could not help it. She saw the glass house from her bedroom window and recognized the species pressing against the clouded glass, saw that someone had once maintained a collection of rare ferns and medicinal plants that were now growing without guidance, competing for light, choking one another. She asked Mrs. Dunning for a pair of shears and a trowel, and Mrs. Dunning, who had perhaps been waiting for exactly this, produced them within the hour. Theodora worked in silence for most of that first day. She cleared the central path first, pulling groundsel and chickweed from between the stones, feeling the garden's geometry emerge beneath her hands, the way a sentence becomes legible as the ink is cleaned. She identified 23 species in the first raised bed alone, 12 of them medicinal, 4 of them rare. A sprawling clump of valerian had seeded itself between the paving stones, its roots so deep she could not pull it without disturbing the bed's drainage. So she left it and made a note to transplant it properly when the soil was softer. She pruned the rosemary back from the chamomile, staked the climbing jasmine that had pulled free of the south wall, and spent an hour untangling a honeysuckle from a climbing rose, separating them without cutting either, because both had been planted deliberately and both deserved to survive. She found, beneath a mat of ground elder, a label written in a careful hand, Digitalis purpurea, planted April 1811, by E.C. The late Duchess. She turned the label over. On the back, in the same hand, smaller, for heart complaints. Dose with extreme care. Beautiful and dangerous, like most useful things. Theodora knelt there for a long time, holding the label in her dirty hands, reading that sentence again. It was the kind of thing a woman writes when she knows she is speaking to the future, to whoever comes next and cares enough to look. She did not mention it to anyone, but she handled the foxgloves with particular care after that, and she began to look for more labels, and she found them, tucked beneath leaves and pressed into the soil at the base of stems, each one a small letter from a woman who had loved this ground and trusted it to remember her. The Duke found her in the garden on the 4th afternoon. She was kneeling in the second raised bed, her hands dark with soil, her hair pinned up in a practical twist that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with keeping it out of the compost. She did not hear him approach. When his shadow fell across the bed, she looked up and saw him standing at the edge of the path, his hands behind his back, his expression unreadable. "You know what you are doing," he said. It was not a question. "I was a botanical cataloguer for 4 years. I have documented over 200 species and managed 3 private collections. And yet you were to be married off to settle a debt." The words landed with precision, and she felt the heat of them. Not anger at him, precisely. Anger at the fact that it was true. "My father did not consider my work a profession," she said. "He considered it a pastime. There is a difference, in his understanding, between a woman who knows things and a woman who is worth things." The Duke said nothing for a long time. Then he looked at the garden, really looked at it, in the way of a man seeing something for the first time that had been in front of him for years. "My mother planted this garden," he said. "Every specimen, every label. She said it was the only part of the estate that answered to patience rather than authority." He paused. "It has not been tended since she was alive. I could not bring myself to let someone else decide what it should become." "I am not deciding," Theodora said. "I am listening to what she intended. The design is still here. It simply needs uncovering." He looked at her then, and something shifted behind those grey eyes, something careful and deliberate, like a door being tested to see if the hinges still held. "Then uncover it," he said. and walked away. The days took on a shape after that, a rhythm that Theodora had not expected and could not quite name. She woke early, took breakfast in the small morning room that Mrs. Dunning had set aside for her, and spent the mornings in the garden. The Duke's household had accepted her presence with the seamless practicality of a staff that had long ago learned not to question their employers' decisions, only to accommodate them. Tate, the footman, brought her water and lunch on a tray without being asked. The cook, whose name was Mrs. Venable, began leaving sprigs of fresh herbs on the kitchen windowsill, with small labels asking Theodora to identify them, which Theodora did, adding notes about medicinal properties and growing conditions until the labels became small letters, and the letters became a correspondence. The Duke appeared in the garden most afternoons. He did not help. He stood or sat nearby, sometimes reading, sometimes simply watching. He asked questions, not the kind that fill silence, but the kind that reveal someone has been thinking. Why had she planted the feverfew on the north side? What was the purpose of the gravel between the beds? Whether the fern collection could survive another winter without the glass-house panes being replaced? She answered him carefully at first, and then less carefully, and then with the kind of directness that happens when you forget to be cautious, because the subject matters more than the audience. She told him about plant taxonomy and soil composition, and the way certain species communicate through their root systems, sharing nutrients with weaker neighbors. She told him about the years with Dr. Howell, the satisfaction of watching a dying specimen revive under correct conditions, the particular pleasure of identifying a plant that had been misclassified for decades. "You speak about plants," he said one afternoon, "the way generals speak about regiments." "Plants are more cooperative than regiments," she said, "and they do not require convincing. You give them what they need, and they do what they were designed to do. It is people who require persuasion. And are you persuading my garden? I am negotiating with it. There is a difference." He almost smiled. She was learning to read the near smile, the way the corner of his mouth changed by a fraction, and his eyes warmed by a shade. It was the expression of a man who had decided, a long time ago, that visible amusement was a concession, and who was slowly discovering that some concessions are worth making. She told him about the correspondence with Mrs. Venable, the letters written on herb labels, the cook's growing curiosity about which plants could be used for food and which for medicine and which for both. She told him that his mother's garden had been designed not just for beauty but for function, every specimen chosen for a reason, every placement deliberate. She did not tell him about her father. She did not tell him about the morning Fenton had arrived at their house with a contract and a smile and the absolute certainty of a man who has purchased something and expects delivery. She did not tell him about the night she had lain in her narrow bed and listened to her father agree, through the study wall, to terms she had not been consulted on, or about the morning after, when her father had looked at her across the breakfast table and said, "It is settled, Theodora," as though she were weather, something to be endured rather than consulted. She did not need to tell him. He seemed to understand that there are some things that explain themselves through the quality of a person's silence. Fenton came on the 9th day. Theodora heard the carriage before she saw it, the particular sound of wheels on the long gravel drive that she had learned to distinguish from the quieter approach of the supply cart. She was in the glass house, her hands occupied with a tray of seedlings, and she set them down with a steadiness she did not feel. From the glass house door, she could see the front of the house. A carriage, dark and polished, had stopped before the steps. Fenton emerged from it like a man stepping onto a stage he had already rehearsed for. He was dressed sharply, navy broadcloth coat, white cravat, boots that shone as though reflecting his own opinion of himself. His face was lean and carefully arranged, pale blue eyes set in an expression that might have been concern if you did not look closely, and condescension if you did. Theodora did not wait to be summoned. She did not wait for Mrs. Dunning, or Tate, or the Duke. She walked across the garden, through the side passage, and into the front hall. Fenton saw her before the Duke did. His face performed surprise, and then relief, and then something harder beneath both. Theodora, thank God. Your father has been beside himself. My father knows precisely where I am, she said. I wrote to him on the second day. This was true. She had written a single paragraph informing him that she was safe, that she would not be returning to honor his arrangement, and that if he wished to discuss the matter, he could do so with her directly rather than through the man he had sold her to. She had not received a reply. Fenton's expression adjusted itself. The concern receded. What replaced it was the look of a man recalculating, not because the situation had changed, but because his first approach had not produced the expected result. Miss Selwyn, I understand that young women sometimes have reservations about marriage. It is natural, but your father and I have an agreement, and that agreement is binding. It is not, she said. I am not a parcel. I cannot be bound by a contract I did not sign, was not consulted on, and do not recognize. The debt is real. The debt is my father's, not mine. If you wish to collect it from him. But you will not collect me. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the particular tension that occurs when a man realizes he is being refused in public, in a house that is not his own, by a woman he had believed was already his. The Duke appeared at the top of the staircase. He did not hurry. He came down the steps with the measured pace of a man who controls the tempo of every room he enters, and when he reached the hall, he did not look at Fenton first. He looked at Theodora. Miss Selwyn, he said. Are you well? Quite well, Your Grace. Only then did he turn to Fenton. Mr. Fenton, I do not recall inviting you. Your Grace, I have come to collect my fiancée. You have come, the Duke said, to collect a woman who is standing in my hall, telling you, in clear and specific terms, that she does not wish to go with you. I suggest you listen to her. She is more articulate than you appear to realize. Fenton's composure cracked. It was a small crack, visible only at the edges, the way porcelain fractures before it breaks. But Theodora saw it, and she knew the Duke saw it too. With respect, Your Grace, this is a private family matter. It ceased to be private when she entered my house. Fenton tried another approach. He softened his voice, tilted his head, adopted the posture of a man being reasonable in difficult circumstances. It was a performance Theodora recognized, because she had watched him perform it for her father, adjusting his manner the way a shopkeeper adjusts his prices, depending on what he thinks the customer can afford. Miss Selwyn is young, he said. She is frightened by the prospect of marriage, as many young women are. I bear her no ill will. I only wish to see the agreement honored, and her future secured. My future, Theodora said, is not a thing you secure. It is a thing I build. And I will not build it in your house, Mr. Fenton, or under your name, or according to the terms of a contract that treated me as a line item in a ledger. The hall was very quiet. Mrs. Dunning stood in the doorway to the kitchen passage. Tate stood near the front door. 2 maids had appeared on the gallery above, looking down. They were not being indiscreet. They were being present in the way that people are present when they understand that what is happening matters, and that it should be witnessed. "You may leave now, Mr. Fenton," the Duke said. "If you have a legal claim to the debt, pursue it through proper channels. You have no legal claim to her." Fenton stood very still. For a moment, Theodora thought he might argue, but he looked at the Duke, at the hall, at the household staff who had assembled in doorways like witnesses gathering for a verdict, and something in him recognized the mathematics of the situation. He was one man in a house full of people who had already decided whose side they were on. He left without another word. The carriage pulled away, and the sound of it faded into the trees, and then there was silence. Theodora did not cry. She did not laugh. She stood in the hall and breathed, and the breathing felt different, as though something that had been pressing against her ribs for months had finally been removed. Mrs. Dunning appeared beside her with a cup of tea, not offered, but simply placed in her hands, warm and steady and practical. Tate unlocked the front door and resumed his post without comment. The two maids on the gallery withdrew as quietly as they had come. The house reassembled itself around her, not pretending nothing had happened, but incorporating what had happened into the rhythm of its day, the way a river incorporates a stone. "Thank you," she said to the Duke. He shook his head. "I did very little. You told him yourself. I merely stood in my own hall and agreed with you." "You stood between us?" "No," he said, and his voice was careful, as though he were choosing each word with the deliberation of a man who understands that words, once given, cannot be retrieved. "I stood beside you. There is a difference, and it is one I would ask you to remember." The garden was nearly restored by the end of the 3rd week. The paths were clear, the beds defined, the glass-house panes replaced with new glass that Mrs. Dunning had ordered without being asked, which Theodora suspected meant the Duke had quietly authorized the expense. The foxgloves were in bloom, the feverfew was thriving, and the label that read Digitalis Purpurea, planted April 1811 by E.C., was clean and legible again, propped against the base of the plant like a small monument. She had found 11 labels in all. She cleaned each one, dried it carefully on the window-sill of the glass house, and returned it to its place. Together they formed a kind of map, not of the garden's layout, which she had already reconstructed from the paths and beds themselves, but of the Duchess's mind, the way she thought about plants and about the world. One label, tucked beneath a sage bush near the south wall, read simply, "Grows best when ignored. I understand the impulse." Theodora had laughed when she found it, alone in the garden, and the sound had startled a wren from the hedge. She had begun to think of the Duchess as someone she knew, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a colleague, a woman who had done the same work in the same soil, and left behind not just a garden, but a philosophy. And the more she understood that philosophy, the more she understood the Duke, and the more she understood why he had not been able to let anyone else tend this ground. It was not a neglect. It was grief too precise to trust to a stranger. Theodora knew she should leave. The danger had passed. Fenton had not returned. Her cousin in Ardley had written to say she was welcome, and the road was clear, and there was no reason, none at all, for her to remain in the house of a man she had known for less than a month. Except that the garden was not finished, and the fern collection needed cataloguing. And Mrs. Venable had asked about the properties of comfrey, and the Duke had begun, in the last few days, to appear in the garden, not just in the afternoons, but in the mornings, sitting on the stone bench near the south wall with a book he never seemed to read, asking questions he already knew the answers to, finding reasons to stay. She did not trust it. That was the truth she carried with her like a stone in her pocket, smooth and heavy and always there. She did not trust kindness from powerful men, because every powerful man she had known had used kindness as currency, something given with the expectation of return. Her father had been kind when he wanted compliance. Fenton had been kind when he wanted possession. Even Dr. Howell, who had valued her work and praised her skill, had paid her half what he would have paid a man, and called her "my little botanist" to his colleagues, as though her competence were a charming novelty rather than a professional reality. Kindness, in her experience, was the velvet glove before the closed fist, and the higher the station of the man offering it, the harder the fist beneath. But the Duke was not kind in the way she had learned to suspect. He was kind in the way of a man who had forgotten how to be anything else, and was slightly embarrassed by it. He did not ask her to stay. He did not suggest that she owed him anything. He did not watch her work with the proprietary gaze of a man surveying his investments. He watched her work with the quiet attention of a man who recognized competence and valued it for its own sake, and who understood, perhaps from his mother's example, that a woman's knowledge is not a decoration to be displayed, but a force to be respected. When she thanked him for the glass-house glass, he said only, "The garden needed it," as though she had nothing to do with it, as though the garden had independently submitted a request. It was the morning of the 23rd day when she found him in the glass-house. He was standing among the ferns, holding a watering can that looked absurd in his large hands, and he was watering the wrong plant. "That is a fern," she said. "It does not need watering. It is getting too much light as it is." He looked at the watering can, then at the fern, then at her. "I was told plants need water." "They do, but that one needs shade and neglect. It thrives on being ignored. I am familiar with the strategy," he said, and his mouth did something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one, in the way that Tuesday is adjacent to Wednesday. She laughed. She had not meant to, and the sound surprised them both. It was a small, startled laugh, the kind that escapes before the guard is fully up, and when it ended, the glass-house was very quiet, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. "Miss Selwyn," he said. "Theodora." It was the first time he had used her first name. It sat in the air between them like a question that had been asked a long time ago, and was only now being heard. "I have no claim on you," he said. "I want to be clear about that. You may leave this house whenever you choose, and I will ensure you have the means to do so safely. You owe me nothing. I have done nothing that deserves owing." "Then why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to stay. And I did not want you to stay without knowing that you are free to go." She looked at him. The watering can was still in his hand. The wrong fern was dripping. The light through the new glass panes was warm and even, the kind of light that makes everything in it look precisely, unsentimentally real. "That is not what powerful men say," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." She reached out and took the watering can from his hand. Their fingers touched. It was brief, and it was not an accident, and neither of them pretended it was. "Show me which ones need water," he said. "All of them except that one," she said. "I will show you." The estate's annual open day fell on the last Saturday of the month. Theodora had not known about it until Mrs. Dunning mentioned, with studied casualness, that the tenants and neighboring families would be visiting the house and grounds, and that the garden had not been part of the tour in 7 years. "Not since her Grace," Mrs. Dunning said. It was always her favorite part. She would walk the visitors through herself, explaining every specimen, Theodora understood what was being asked, and what was not being said. The day arrived warm and clear. The tenants came first, then the neighbouring families, then the local gentry, arriving in carriages and on horseback, filling the grounds with the particular noise of people who are impressed and trying not to show it. The house tour was conducted by Mrs. Dunning, with her usual precision. The library was admired, the portrait gallery was discussed, the ballroom was noted as unchanged. And then the garden. Theodora led the tour herself. She wore a dress that Mrs. Dunning had arranged, cream linen with small green buttons, and her hair was pinned in a careful twist that had everything to do with respect for the occasion, and nothing to do with vanity. She walked the visitors through each bed, each path, each section of the restored glass house, explaining the species and their properties, their histories, their relationships to one another. She showed them the climbing rose and the honeysuckle growing side by side on the south wall, and she told them about the Duchess's labels, each one a note left for the future, each one found and carefully cleaned and returned to its place. She showed them the foxgloves. She read aloud the note on the back of the label, the one about beautiful and dangerous things, and the group went quiet, the particular quiet of people hearing something they did not expect and finding it true. A child asked why the chamomile grew in circles. Theodora knelt down to his height and explained that chamomile spreads from the center outward, sending runners through the soil, and that if you planted it in a square, it would make itself round within 2 years, because that was its nature, and nature doesn't take instruction from geometry. The child nodded solemnly, as though this confirmed something he had always suspected. She did not notice at first the murmur that passed through the group, but Mrs. Dunning noticed, and Tate noticed, and the Duke, who stood at the back of the group with his hands behind his back and his grey eyes steady, noticed. The visitors were looking at her the way people look at someone who belongs in a place so completely that it is difficult to imagine the place without them. When the tour ended, an older woman, Lady Barrow from the neighbouring estate, approached Theodora and said, "My dear, your knowledge is extraordinary. The late Duchess would have been very pleased." She took Theodora's hand in both of hers and held it for a moment, and the gesture was so plain and so warm that Theodora had to look away. Another woman asked if she might bring her daughter to study the medicinal collection. A tenant farmer asked about the comfrey, whether it might be grown on his land for poultice use, and Theodora told him the soil conditions it required and the best time to harvest, and he wrote it down on the back of his hand with a pencil stub because he had no paper. 3 separate people asked the Duke, within his hearing, whether Miss Selwyn might be persuaded to establish a public garden for the parish. The Duke said nothing to any of them. He simply looked at Theodora across the garden, and she looked at him, and between them was the kind of understanding that does not require declaration, because it is already, quietly, complete. That evening, after the last carriage had gone, and the grounds were empty, and the garden sat in the long blue light of a summer dusk, Theodora walked to the front gate. She had not been back to it since the day she arrived. It looked different now, or she looked different. The iron wolves on the hinges gleamed in the fading light. The crest above the gate was carved deep into the stone, the Cresswell arms, a shield and a motto she could now read. Fidelis in silentio. Faithful in silence. She stood there for a long time, reading it. She heard his step on the gravel before she saw him. He came to stand beside her, not touching her, not speaking. They looked at the gate together. "I didn't read it," she said. "The day I came. I didn't look." "No," he said. "You were running." "I am not running now." He turned to her. The light was soft, and his face was open, in a way she hadn't seen before, the careful control relaxed, the flint-grey eyes warm. "Stay," he said. "Not because I am asking. Not because you have nowhere else. Stay because this is where you choose to be." She did not answer with words. She had learned in this house that some things are better communicated through action than through speech. She reached up, took his face in both her hands, and kissed him. It was a quiet kiss, steady and certain, the kind that does not need to be dramatic because it has already been earned. When she pulled back, he was looking at her as though she were a species he had never encountered, rare and resilient and entirely herself. "I will stay," she said. Behind them, the gate stood open. The drive stretched out toward the road, the oaks lining it tall and patient, their branches interlaced above like the arches of a cathedral. The evening settled around them, soft and golden, and neither of them moved to go inside. There was no hurry. The house was behind them, solid and lit and waiting, and the garden was resting in the dusk, and the gate was open, and she had read the crest, and she had chosen the door.